What if I told you that the test millions of people use to prove their intelligence was originally designed for something totally different? In 2025, IQ testing has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, with online tests promising to reveal your true intellectual potential in just 20 minutes. But what many don't realize is that modern IQ tests might be the worst way to actually measure how smart someone is. Alfred Binet, who created the first intelligence test, intended it to work like a thermometer for diagnosing which students needed help, a temporary measure of current performance, not a permanent label. The evidence will completely change how you think about intelligence, starting with the real story behind these tests. The shocking origin story nobody talks about. The story everyone tells about IQ tests is completely wrong. Walk into any bookstore and you'll find dozens of books claiming these tests were designed to identify the next Einstein or help companies find brilliant employees. The real story is much more ordinary and frankly disturbing when you understand what actually happened. Alfred Binet never set out to create a test that would rank human intelligence. In 1905, he faced a very specific problem that had nothing to do with finding geniuses. The French government had recently passed mandatory education laws requiring every child to attend school, regardless of their background or abilities. Suddenly, teachers across France found themselves with classrooms full of students who had wildly different levels of preparation and ability. Picture a teacher in 1905 Paris trying to manage a classroom where some kids could already read fluently while others had never held a book. Some students came from wealthy families with private tutors, while others had spent their childhood working in factories or farms. The teachers were drowning. They had no systematic way to figure out which children needed extra help and which ones were ready for advanced material. The French Ministry of Education approached Binet with a simple request: create a tool to identify students who were struggling so they could receive additional support. Notice what they didn't ask for. They didn't want a test to prove some children were naturally superior to others. They didn't want a permanent label that would follow kids for the rest of their lives. They wanted a diagnostic tool, similar to how a doctor might check your temperature to see if you're sick. Binet took this request seriously and developed what became known as the Binet-Simon scale. The test covered 5 main categories: memory, reasoning, language use, visual imagery, and knowledge that reflected what children typically learned in French schools at that time. But Binet was extremely careful about how his test should be used. He insisted that the results only showed a child's current performance, not their permanent intellectual capacity. More importantly, Binet repeatedly warned against treating his test scores as fixed measurements. He argued that intelligence could be improved through education and practice. He compared his test to measuring a child's height, useful for understanding their current state, but meaningless for predicting their final adult height or overall worth as a person. In his published work between 1905 and 1912, Binet specifically cautioned against using his test to create permanent categories or to suggest that some children were inherently inferior to others. These warnings became prophetic when American psychologists got their hands on Binet's work. In the 1910s, researchers like Louis Terman at Stanford University transformed Binet's diagnostic tool into something far more problematic. Terman's Stanford-Binet revisions shifted from mental age ratios to normative scoring and embraced a fixed view of intelligence, exactly the kind of permanent labeling that Binet had warned against. American psychologists started using modified versions of Binet's test to justify excluding immigrants at Ellis Island. They administered the tests in English to people who barely spoke the language, then used the low scores as evidence that certain ethnic groups were intellectually inferior. The U.S. Army used these tests during World War I to segregate soldiers and exclude minorities from officer training programs. The transformation became even more disturbing when eugenicists adopted IQ testing as scientific justification for their policies. They argued that IQ scores proved some racial and ethnic groups were genetically inferior and should be prevented from reproducing. Several U.S. states passed forced sterilization laws based partially on IQ test results, with the Supreme Court upholding their constitutionality in the 1927 Buck v. Bell decision. Over 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States under these laws. Mainstream psychologists later rejected these views, but the damage had already been done. Throughout this entire period, the testing industry continued to grow and profit, while conveniently forgetting the humanitarian concerns that Binet had raised. Test publishers marketed their products as scientific instruments that could objectively measure human worth, despite knowing that Binet himself had rejected this interpretation of his work. The modern IQ testing industry has inherited this problematic legacy while maintaining the profitable fiction that their tests measure something fundamental about human intelligence. Companies now make billions of dollars selling tests, preparation materials, and score interpretation services. Online platforms promise to reveal your true IQ for a small fee, as if they're uncovering some essential truth about your brain, rather than measuring your performance on a specific set of culturally biased questions. What makes this history particularly frustrating is how easily we could have avoided these problems. Binet's original vision was actually quite reasonable, use testing as one tool among many to help children succeed in school, while recognizing that performance can change over time with proper support and education. Instead, we created an entire industry built on the premise that a single number can capture the complexity of human intelligence. The disconnect between Binet's intentions and modern IQ testing reveals the fundamental flaw in how we think about these tests today. When someone brags about their high IQ score or uses test results to make judgments about other people's capabilities, they're participating in a system that operates on completely different assumptions than what the original creator intended. This historical transformation shows why we should be skeptical of any claims about what IQ tests actually measure. The tests weren't designed to identify genius or rank human worth. They were created as a temporary diagnostic tool for one specific educational system in early 20th century France. Everything else, the permanent scoring, the ranking systems, the claims about inherited intelligence, was added later by people who had very different goals than helping struggling students. The tragedy is that Binet's humanitarian approach to testing could have prevented decades of misuse and discrimination. Instead of creating tools to help people reach their potential, we built an industry that profits from labeling and ranking them. This foundation problem runs deeper than just historical curiosity. If IQ tests were built for a completely different purpose than how we use them today, then we need to examine what these modern tests are actually measuring when psychologists administer them. What modern IQ tests actually measure, spoiler, it's not what you think. Step into a psychologist's office today, and you'll encounter one of several standardized intelligence tests that have remained surprisingly unchanged despite decades of criticism. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, known as the WAISIV, dominates adult testing. While children typically receive the WASCV, these tests represent the current gold standard for measuring what psychologists call intelligence, but understanding what they actually evaluate reveals some serious limitations. The WAISIV breaks down human cognitive ability into 4 areas: verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. The Stanford Binet test takes a slightly different approach by focusing on 5 main areas: baseline knowledge, basic mathematics, visualizing objects in space, working memory, and fluid reasoning. Both tests create comprehensive pictures of performance within these specific domains, but they operate within the same narrow framework. These modern tests completely ignore vast areas of human cognitive ability that most people would consider essential components of intelligence. Creativity receives no attention whatsoever, despite being crucial for innovation and problem-solving in real-world situations. Emotional intelligence, which involves understanding your own feelings and reading other people's emotional states, doesn't appear anywhere in the testing protocol. Social skills that determine success in relationships and collaborative work environments are entirely absent from the evaluation process. The tests also skip practical problem-solving abilities that people use constantly in daily life. You might excel at abstract reasoning tasks on an IQ test, but struggle to figure out why your car won't start or how to resolve a conflict with a coworker. The ability to navigate complex social situations, understand cultural nuances, or adapt to unexpected circumstances doesn't register on these assessments. Howard Gardner's research on multiple intelligences demonstrates just how much current IQ tests miss. Gardner identified several distinct types of intelligence that traditional tests ignore completely: musical intelligence, spatial intelligence, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, and interpersonal intelligence. A person might have extraordinary musical ability, capable of composing complex symphonies or improvising jazz solos that move audiences to tears, but this talent wouldn't register on any standardized IQ test. Similarly, someone with exceptional spatial intelligence might excel at architecture, engineering, or sculpture while scoring poorly on verbal reasoning tasks. Modern IQ tests operate with similar limitations to measuring only knife skills when evaluating cooking ability. They measure specific cognitive skills that correlate with certain types of performance, but they miss the broader picture of how people actually use their minds to navigate the world. The correlation between IQ scores and academic grades is about 0.5, which means these tests explain only about 25% of the variance in school performance. Academic success depends on many factors beyond what IQ tests measure, including persistence, motivation, study habits, and social support systems. The circular nature of IQ testing becomes apparent when you examine what the tests actually predict. They're reasonably good at forecasting performance on other similar tests and success in traditional academic settings that value the same narrow set of skills. But this creates a self-reinforcing system where we use tests to measure intelligence, then point to their correlation with academic success as evidence that they're measuring something meaningful about human cognitive ability. The time limits built into these tests add another layer of problematic assumptions about intelligence. Processing speed represents one of the four major categories in modern IQ tests, which means your final score partially reflects how quickly you can complete cognitive tasks. This approach assumes that faster thinking equals better thinking, but real-world intelligence often requires careful deliberation rather than rapid responses. Many of history's greatest thinkers were known for their methodical, slow approach to complex problems. They took time to consider multiple perspectives, gather additional information, and think through the implications of different solutions. This kind of thoughtful intelligence doesn't show up well on timed tests that reward quick pattern recognition and rapid information processing. Recent research has examined how people with high IQ scores performed on real-world problem-solving tasks that required emotional awareness and cultural understanding. The researchers found that traditional test performance often failed to predict success on these more complex challenges. Participants who excelled at abstract reasoning and verbal comprehension sometimes struggled when problems involved reading social cues, understanding cultural context, or managing interpersonal dynamics. The study revealed that intelligence in natural settings operates very differently from intelligence in testing environments. Real problems rarely come with clear instructions, obvious solution paths, or time limits. They often require collaboration with other people, understanding of social and cultural factors, and the ability to work with incomplete or contradictory information. Modern IQ tests essentially measure how well you perform within the specific constraints and assumptions of standardized testing environments. They evaluate your ability to work quickly on abstract problems that have clear right and wrong answers. They assess your familiarity with the types of reasoning and knowledge that Western educational systems emphasize. They test your comfort with formal testing situations and your ability to maintain focus under time pressure. These are legitimate cognitive skills that have practical value in certain contexts. Academic settings, some professional environments, and various technical fields do reward the abilities that IQ tests measure. The problem arises when we mistake performance in this narrow domain for a comprehensive assessment of human intelligence. The four categories measured by modern tests represent a tiny slice of human cognitive capability. They focus on skills that happen to be valued in traditional academic settings and correlate with performance in educational institutions designed around similar principles. But correlation doesn't equal causation, and academic performance represents only one aspect of intelligent behavior. Understanding what modern IQ tests actually measure helps explain why they can seem both useful and frustrating at the same time. They provide reasonably consistent measurements of specific cognitive abilities that matter for certain types of tasks, but they completely miss the vast majority of ways that people demonstrate intelligence in their daily lives, relationships, creative endeavors, and practical problem solving. The tests have become sophisticated instruments for measuring a very particular type of cognitive performance, while remaining blind to most forms of human intelligence that actually matter for success and fulfillment in life. This narrow focus has created an entire culture of people who mistake test-taking ability for genuine intellectual achievement. The Mensa myth and other high IQ comedies. Organizations like Mensa perfectly illustrate how this confusion plays out in practice. This high IQ society requires members to score 130 or higher on standardized intelligence tests, placing them in the top 2% of the population. With approximately 140,000 members worldwide, Mensa should theoretically represent a concentration of some of the brightest minds on the planet. Yet examining what this supposed intellectual elite has actually accomplished reveals surprisingly underwhelming results. The organization's meetings primarily consist of social gatherings where members solve crossword puzzles, play board games, and engage in what amounts to elaborate intellectual validation. They host trivia nights, organize puzzle competitions, and spend considerable time congratulating each other for achieving high scores on tests that measure a narrow range of cognitive abilities. Despite having access to thousands of people who supposedly possess superior intelligence, Mensa has failed to produce any significant scientific breakthroughs, technological innovations, or solutions to major world problems. This disconnect between high test scores and meaningful accomplishment becomes even more apparent when you consider that many of history's most transformative thinkers would never have qualified for Mensa membership. Richard Feynman, whose contributions to quantum physics earned him a Nobel Prize and revolutionized our understanding of fundamental particles, had an estimated IQ of only 125. This score falls 5 points below Mensa's cutoff, meaning one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century wouldn't have been considered smart enough to join their puzzle-solving club. Feynman's case illustrates the absurdity of using IQ scores as gatekeepers for intellectual recognition. His ability to visualize complex quantum phenomena, explain difficult concepts in simple terms, and approach problems from completely original angles represented forms of intelligence that traditional tests completely miss. He was known for his unconventional thinking methods, his ability to teach complex physics to undergraduates, and his talent for finding elegant solutions to seemingly impossible problems. None of these capabilities would have shown up on the standardized tests that Mensa uses to determine membership. Steve Jobs provides another example of how IQ-based thinking fails to capture real-world intelligence. Although he never took a formal IQ test, his college professors described him as a mediocre student who showed more interest in philosophy and Eastern spirituality than traditional academic subjects. Jobs struggled with conventional learning environments and dropped out of Reed College after just one semester. Yet his ability to understand consumer psychology, anticipate technological trends, and create products that transformed entire industries demonstrated forms of intelligence that no standardized test could have predicted or measured. The irony deepens when you realize that many Mensa members work in ordinary jobs and live conventional lives, despite their supposedly superior cognitive abilities. The organization's newsletters and publications are filled with members discussing their careers as middle managers, accountants, and administrative assistants. While these are perfectly respectable professions, they hardly represent the kind of world-changing achievements you might expect from people whose test scores place them among the intellectual elite. This pattern suggests that the skills measured by IQ tests have limited relevance to the kinds of intelligence that actually matter for innovation and creative problem-solving. The ability to quickly identify patterns in abstract designs or manipulate numbers in your head doesn't necessarily translate into the capacity to envision new possibilities, understand complex human motivations, or persist through years of difficult work to bring revolutionary ideas to fruition. The rise of online IQ testing has made the situation even more ridiculous. Dozens of websites now promise to reveal your true genius level through tests that take 15 to 20 minutes and cost between $9.99 and $19.99. These platforms use sophisticated marketing techniques to make people feel like they're uncovering some deep truth about their cognitive abilities, when they're actually just measuring performance on a specific type of puzzle that has little connection to real-world intelligence. The marketing language around these online tests reveals the psychological appeal of IQ scores. Sites promise to help you discover your hidden potential, unlock your intellectual power, or join the ranks of certified geniuses. They tap into people's desire to feel special and validated, offering scientific-sounding confirmation that they possess superior mental abilities. The fact that thousands of people pay for these services demonstrates how desperately we want to quantify and rank human intelligence, even when the measurements are fundamentally meaningless. Social media has amplified this trend by creating platforms where people can share their IQ test results like they're posting their zodiac signs or personality-type results. You can find entire communities dedicated to discussing and comparing test scores, with members treating their numbers as core aspects of their identity. This phenomenon represents a particularly modern form of intellectual insecurity, where people seek validation through standardized measurements rather than actual accomplishments or contributions. The comedy becomes tragic when you consider how this obsession with IQ scores affects people's self-perception and life choices. Individuals who score highly on these tests sometimes develop an inflated sense of their abilities and expect success to come easily, while those who score lower may underestimate their potential in areas that tests don't measure. Both outcomes represent fundamental misunderstandings of how intelligence actually works in real-world contexts. Perhaps most absurd is watching people base their entire sense of intellectual worth on performance in a single testing session that measures such a narrow range of human cognitive ability. Someone might excel at identifying geometric patterns under time pressure while struggling to understand social dynamics, creative expression, or practical problem-solving. Yet the IQ testing industry has convinced millions of people that pattern recognition ability represents the most important form of intelligence. When Mensa members gather to solve puzzles and congratulate each other on their test performance, they're participating in an elaborate form of intellectual theater that has little connection to the kinds of intelligence that actually change the world. Their high scores represent proficiency in a narrow academic skill set, not the creative vision, emotional understanding, or practical wisdom that drive real innovation and meaningful human achievement. But the problems with IQ testing run even deeper than these cultural absurdities suggest. The motivation scandal that changes everything. The most damaging evidence against IQ testing comes from research that most people have never heard about. Your level of motivation while taking an intelligence test can swing your final score by up to 20 points in either direction. This means the difference between being labeled as average intelligence or qualifying for Mensa membership might depend entirely on how much you care about the test results on that particular day. A comprehensive 2011 meta-analysis examined this motivation effect across multiple studies and found results that should make everyone question the validity of IQ scores. Researchers discovered that people who received just $10 for performing well on intelligence tests scored significantly higher than participants who received no financial incentive at all. The monetary reward was tiny, equivalent to buying lunch at a fast food restaurant, yet it produced measurable improvements in cognitive performance that translated directly into higher IQ scores. The implications of this finding extend far beyond the laboratory. Every celebrity IQ score you've seen mentioned in articles or documentaries becomes meaningless without knowing the circumstances under which the test was administered. Did the person take the test seriously, or were they just going through the motions? Were they motivated to perform well, or did they view it as an annoying obligation? These contextual factors can create score variations large enough to move someone from the average range into the gifted category, or vice versa. Recent studies have revealed even more dramatic effects when researchers systematically varied the perceived importance of intelligence tests. One particularly revealing study examined how parental involvement affected student performance on intelligence tests. Researchers divided participants into two groups and gave them identical tests under identical conditions. The only difference was the information provided about how results would be used. Students who were told their IQ scores would be shared with their parents scored an average of 15 points higher than students who were told the results would remain completely anonymous. This 15-point difference represents a massive shift in perceived intellectual ability. Someone scoring 100 with anonymous results would score 115 when they believed their parents would see the outcome. That single change in motivation moves a person from the 50th percentile to the 84th percentile, transforming them from average intelligence to above average based purely on social pressure rather than cognitive ability. The pattern extends to professional testing situations as well. People taking intelligence tests as part of job application processes consistently score differently than individuals taking identical tests for entertainment or curiosity. The high-stakes nature of employment testing creates pressure that affects performance in ways that have nothing to do with actual problem-solving ability or intellectual capacity. These motivation effects expose a fundamental problem with how we interpret famous people's supposed IQ scores. The widely cited claim that Albert Einstein had an IQ of 160 exemplifies this issue perfectly. Einstein never actually took a formal intelligence test during his lifetime. The score of 160 represents an estimate created by psychologists decades after his death, based on biographical analysis of his achievements and writings. This posthumous estimation process makes the number completely meaningless as a measure of his actual test-taking performance. The same problem applies to virtually every historical figure whose IQ score gets mentioned in popular media. These numbers are typically estimates, guesses, or extrapolations rather than results from actual standardized testing sessions. Without knowing the specific circumstances under which someone took a test, including their motivation level, stress state, and perceived stakes, the resulting score provides little useful information about their cognitive abilities. The motivation effect has become so well documented that some researchers now argue IQ tests function more as measures of persistence and test-taking anxiety than as assessments of intelligence. This perspective suggests that high scores might indicate someone's ability to maintain focus under pressure and their willingness to invest effort in abstract problem-solving tasks, rather than their fundamental cognitive capacity. Consider what this means for the entire enterprise of intelligence testing. If offering someone $10 can boost their IQ score by 20 points, then the test is measuring something that can be dramatically influenced by external factors unrelated to brain function or learning ability. A 20-point swing represents the difference between being classified as having a learning disability or being considered intellectually gifted, depending entirely on motivation level during a single testing session. The research reveals that people approach intelligence tests with vastly different levels of engagement, depending on what they perceive to be at stake. Someone taking an online IQ test for fun might put in minimal effort, while the same person facing a test that could affect their college admission or job prospects might work much harder on identical questions. These effort differences translate directly into score variations that can completely change how their intellectual abilities are perceived and categorized. The situation becomes even more problematic when you consider how intelligence test results are used in educational and clinical settings. Schools use these scores to place students in gifted programs or special education services. Psychologists use them to diagnose learning disabilities and intellectual impairments. Employers use similar tests to screen job candidates. All of these high-stakes decisions rely on numbers that can fluctuate dramatically based on factors that have nothing to do with actual cognitive ability. The motivation scandal also explains why people can score differently on the same test when they retake it under different circumstances. Someone who initially takes an intelligence test casually might score 20 points higher when they retake it, after being told the results will determine their eligibility for scholarship or job opportunity. This variability suggests that IQ scores reflect a complex interaction between cognitive ability, motivation, anxiety, and situational factors, rather than measuring pure intelligence. Understanding the motivation effect should fundamentally change how we interpret any IQ score, whether it belongs to a famous historical figure, a job candidate, or ourselves. These numbers represent performance on a specific test under specific circumstances, heavily influenced by factors that have little to do with actual intellectual capacity. The fact that such a simple intervention as a $10 reward can produce such dramatic score changes reveals that IQ tests measure far more than just cognitive ability. But motivation represents just one of several ways that these tests fail to capture what we think of as intelligence. Cultural bias when intelligence tests get lost in translation. Another equally significant problem emerges when examining how intelligence tests handle cultural differences. Intelligence tests promise to measure universal cognitive ability, but they actually evaluate how well you navigate the specific cultural assumptions built into the questions by their creators. This bias runs so deep that test takers from different backgrounds can interpret identical questions in completely different ways, leading to score variations that have nothing to do with actual intellectual capacity. Consider an actual question that appears on widely used intelligence tests. What should you do if you find someone's wallet on the street? The test creators have predetermined that the correct answer is to turn the wallet in to the police. This response assumes you live in a community where police officers are trusted, accessible, and viewed as appropriate authorities for handling lost property. But this assumption doesn't hold true across different cultural contexts around the world. In many communities, the smartest and most socially appropriate response would be to ask community elders for guidance or attempt to return the wallet directly to the owner's family. Some cultures emphasize collective responsibility and community-based problem-solving over involvement with formal authorities. Others have historical reasons to distrust police intervention in everyday matters. A person from these backgrounds who chooses the culturally appropriate response for their community gets marked wrong on an intelligence test, despite demonstrating sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and cultural norms. The wallet question illustrates how IQ tests embed specific cultural values into their measurement of intelligence. The test assumes that involving official authorities represents the most intelligent approach to moral dilemmas, but this reflects the perspective of the predominantly white middle-class psychologists who created these assessments rather than universal principles of smart decision-making. Verbal sections of intelligence tests present even more obvious cultural bias problems because they directly test vocabulary and cultural references that vary dramatically between communities. These sections ask test takers to define words, explain relationships between concepts, and demonstrate knowledge that reflects specific educational and social experiences. A child who grows up hearing academic vocabulary at home will perform better on these sections than an equally intelligent child whose family uses different linguistic patterns or speaks multiple languages. A 2024 study revealed the extent of this interpretive bias by examining how children from different socioeconomic backgrounds understood identical IQ test questions. Even when all participants spoke the same language fluently, they interpreted questions in ways that reflected their distinct cultural experiences and knowledge bases. The researchers found that children from working-class families often provided responses that demonstrated sophisticated reasoning, but didn't match the expected answers that reflected middle-class assumptions about correct behavior and appropriate knowledge. Visual spatial questions seem like they should avoid cultural bias since they don't rely on language, but they actually carry their own set of cultural assumptions. These sections often test familiarity with specific types of geometric patterns, spatial relationships, and visual problem-solving approaches that are emphasized in Western educational systems. Students who have spent years working with particular types of mathematical representations and geometric concepts will naturally perform better than those whose educational experiences emphasized different spatial reasoning skills. Indigenous communities provide compelling examples of how cultural bias affects test performance despite sophisticated intelligence and problem-solving abilities. Many indigenous cultures have developed complex knowledge systems for navigation, resource management, ecological understanding, and social organization that require high levels of cognitive ability and abstract reasoning. Yet members of these communities often score lower on traditional IQ tests because the tests don't recognize or measure the forms of intelligence that their cultures value and develop. Traditional indigenous navigation techniques involve memorizing complex environmental patterns, understanding seasonal changes, and making precise calculations about distance and direction using natural landmarks. These skills require the same cognitive abilities that IQ tests claim to measure, including spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and logical problem solving. But because indigenous navigation knowledge doesn't align with the specific types of spatial tasks used in standardized tests, this sophisticated intelligence remains invisible to conventional assessment methods. Researchers have conducted experiments that reveal the extent of cultural bias by creating culturally adapted intelligence tests for different communities. When the same individuals take both traditional IQ tests and culturally adapted versions, their scores often differ dramatically depending on which test they receive. These experiments demonstrate that performance variations reflect the cultural assumptions embedded in different testing approaches, rather than actual differences in cognitive ability. The American Psychological Association's research has found that cultural and socioeconomic factors account for significant portions of test score variations, with estimates suggesting that nearly 30% of performance differences result from cultural bias rather than genuine intelligence differences. This finding undermines the entire premise of using IQ tests to make meaningful comparisons between individuals from different backgrounds. Language proficiency creates another layer of cultural bias that affects test performance in ways that have nothing to do with intelligence. A 2024 study found that students with strong vocabulary skills scored an average of 20% higher on standardized tests compared to peers with more limited academic language exposure. This advantage reflects educational and social opportunities rather than cognitive capacity, but it gets interpreted as evidence of superior intelligence. Children who grow up in bilingual households face particular challenges on intelligence tests designed for monolingual speakers. They may have strong cognitive abilities in multiple languages, but perform poorly on tests that assume fluency in academic English and familiarity with specific cultural references. Research shows that bilingual children often demonstrate superior cognitive flexibility and problem-solving skills compared to monolingual peers, but these advantages don't appear on traditional IQ assessments. The cultural bias problem extends beyond individual test questions to the entire framework of how intelligence gets defined and measured. IQ tests reflect particular assumptions about what kinds of thinking matter most, what forms of knowledge indicate intelligence, and what problem-solving approaches deserve recognition. These assumptions emerged from specific historical and cultural contexts that don't represent universal standards for cognitive ability. Understanding cultural bias in intelligence testing reveals that IQ scores primarily measure how well someone fits into the cultural framework assumed by test creators. They assess familiarity with specific types of knowledge, problem-solving approaches, and social assumptions rather than pure cognitive ability. This recognition should fundamentally change how we interpret and use intelligence test results, particularly when making comparisons between individuals from different cultural backgrounds. The cultural bias embedded in IQ tests demonstrates that these assessments function more like measures of cultural assimilation than universal indicators of human intelligence. But cultural assumptions represent just one category of external factors that can dramatically alter test performance regardless of actual cognitive ability. The environmental factors that make IQ scores meaningless. Your performance on an IQ test depends far more on external circumstances than on your actual cognitive abilities. Simple factors like whether you got enough sleep the night before or ate breakfast that morning can create score differences large enough to move you between different intelligence categories. This reality exposes a fundamental problem with using these tests to make meaningful judgments about human cognitive capacity. Sleep deprivation represents one of the most dramatic environmental influences on test performance. Research demonstrates that lacking adequate rest can temporarily reduce your IQ score by 10 to 15 points. This means someone who normally functions as a highly capable individual could appear average or below average on a test administered after pulling an all-nighter. The cognitive impairment from sleep loss affects attention, working memory, and processing speed in ways that directly impact the skills these tests measure. Consider what this means for the validity of any particular test score. A student taking an entrance exam after staying up late studying might score 15 points lower than they would after a full night's rest. That difference could determine admission to college programs or qualification for scholarships. The same person could literally test as having different levels of intelligence depending entirely on their sleep schedule leading up to the assessment. Hunger creates similar cognitive impairments that show up directly in test scores. When people haven't eaten for several hours, their performance on cognitive assessments drops measurably. The brain requires steady glucose supply to maintain optimal function, and blood sugar fluctuations affect concentration, memory, and problem-solving abilities in ways that have nothing to do with underlying intelligence. These immediate physiological factors represent just the surface level of environmental influences on IQ scores. The deeper problem lies in how long-term environmental conditions shape cognitive development and test performance in ways that can completely obscure someone's true potential. Children growing up in low-income households face environmental challenges that consistently lower their test scores by an average of 12 to 15 points compared to peers from more affluent backgrounds. This substantial gap disappears when researchers control for factors like nutrition quality, healthcare access, and educational resources. The score difference reflects environmental disadvantages rather than innate cognitive differences between children from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Low-income children often experience chronic nutritional stress that affects brain development during critical periods. They may lack access to healthcare that could address vision problems, hearing issues, or other conditions that impact learning. Their schools frequently have fewer resources, larger class sizes, and less experienced teachers. These accumulated disadvantages create testing environments where children cannot demonstrate their actual cognitive abilities. Environmental toxins present another category of factors that permanently damage cognitive performance in ways that show up on intelligence tests. Lead exposure, even at levels previously considered safe by health authorities, can reduce IQ scores by 5 to 10 points permanently. Children in older housing with lead paint or areas with contaminated water supplies face cognitive impairments that will affect their test performance throughout their lives. Air pollution represents a more recently recognized threat to cognitive development that affects test performance. Children living in areas with high levels of air pollution consistently score lower on intelligence tests compared to peers in cleaner environments. The pollutants cause inflammation and oxidative stress in developing brains, leading to measurable cognitive impairments that persist over time. Chronic stress from poverty, trauma, or unstable living situations affects brain development in profound ways that show up as lower test scores. Children experiencing ongoing stress produce elevated levels of cortisol and other stress hormones that interfere with normal brain development. These biological changes impair memory formation, attention regulation, and executive function in ways that directly impact the cognitive skills measured by IQ tests. Educational quality and early childhood experiences create perhaps the most significant environmental influences on test performance. Children with access to high-quality early education, enriching learning environments, and supportive academic experiences consistently score higher on intelligence tests. These advantages reflect opportunity rather than innate ability, but they get interpreted as evidence of superior intelligence. The educational environment effect extends beyond formal schooling to include factors like parental involvement, availability of books and learning materials, and exposure to intellectually stimulating experiences. Children whose families can afford music lessons, art classes, educational trips, and other enrichment activities develop cognitive skills that translate directly into higher test scores. Infectious diseases present another environmental threat to cognitive development that affects test scores. Countries with high rates of infectious diseases show lower average IQ scores, reflecting the impact of illness on brain development rather than genetic intelligence differences. Diseases can interfere with normal cognitive development, particularly during early childhood when the brain is most vulnerable. Dietary habits influence cognitive performance and test scores in measurable ways. Children with access to nutritious food consistently show higher intelligence test scores than peers with poor nutrition. This relationship reflects the brain's need for proper nutrients during development, rather than inherent cognitive differences between children from different backgrounds. These environmental influences operate at multiple levels simultaneously, creating complex interactions that can completely mask someone's true cognitive potential. A child facing multiple environmental challenges might score poorly on intelligence tests despite having excellent underlying cognitive abilities that never get the chance to develop properly. The cumulative impact of these environmental factors creates a situation where IQ scores function more as measures of environmental privilege than cognitive ability. Someone growing up with optimal nutrition, clean air, safe housing, quality education, healthcare access, and enriching experiences will naturally score higher than someone facing environmental challenges, regardless of their underlying cognitive potential. Understanding these environmental effects reveals that IQ scores primarily reflect the circumstances of someone's upbringing rather than their innate intelligence. The tests measure the interaction between cognitive potential and environmental opportunity, making them fundamentally unreliable as assessments of pure intellectual ability. But this raises an even more fundamental question about whether intelligence can be captured by any single measurement system at all. Multiple intelligences, why your brain might be brilliant in ways tests can't measure. Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences fundamentally challenges the entire premise of reducing human cognitive ability to a single number. Gardner argues that intelligence operates more like a symphony orchestra than a solo performance, with different cognitive abilities working together in complex ways that traditional IQ tests completely miss. His framework identifies at least 8 distinct types of intelligence that operate independently and contribute differently to human success and fulfillment. The 8 intelligences Gardner identified include linguistic intelligence for language and communication, logical mathematical intelligence for reasoning and computation, spatial intelligence for visual and three-dimensional thinking, musical intelligence for rhythm and sound patterns, bodily kinesthetic intelligence for physical coordination and movement, interpersonal intelligence for understanding other people, intrapersonal intelligence for self-awareness and emotional regulation, and naturalistic intelligence for recognizing patterns in the natural world. Each form of intelligence represents a different way that brains can excel at processing information and solving problems. Someone might struggle with the logical mathematical reasoning that IQ tests emphasize while possessing extraordinary musical intelligence that allows them to compose symphonies or understand complex harmonic relationships. Traditional intelligence testing would miss this musical brilliance entirely because it doesn't fit into the narrow categories that standardized assessments measure. Consider a master chef working in a professional kitchen during the dinner rush. They demonstrate incredible sensory intelligence by tasting dishes and immediately identifying which spices need adjustment. They show spatial reasoning by coordinating multiple cooking processes simultaneously while navigating a crowded kitchen efficiently. They exhibit temporal intelligence by timing different cooking stages perfectly so that complex meals come together at exactly the right moment. None of these sophisticated cognitive abilities would appear on a traditional IQ test, yet they require the same kind of pattern recognition, problem solving, and information processing that intelligence tests claim to measure. Professional athletes provide another compelling example of intelligence that operates outside traditional testing frameworks. A basketball player making split-second decisions about where to pass the ball must process visual information, predict movement patterns, calculate distances and angles, and coordinate complex physical movements all within milliseconds. This bodily kinesthetic intelligence requires the same rapid information processing and pattern recognition that IQ tests measure, but it operates through physical rather than verbal or mathematical channels. Musicians process complex auditory patterns and emotional information in ways that reveal sophisticated cognitive abilities that IQ tests ignore completely. A jazz musician improvising during a performance must simultaneously track harmonic progressions, respond to other musicians' choices, maintain rhythmic patterns, and express emotional content through their instrument. This musical intelligence requires working memory, pattern recognition, creative problem solving, and real-time information processing that demonstrates cognitive sophistication. Social workers and therapists demonstrate high levels of interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence that enable them to understand and help people in ways that have nothing to do with logical reasoning or mathematical computation. These professionals must read subtle emotional cues, understand complex family dynamics, recognize patterns in human behavior, and develop intervention strategies that address psychological and social problems. The interpersonal intelligence required for effective therapy involves understanding how different people process emotions, communicate their needs, and respond to various approaches. A skilled therapist can recognize when someone is struggling with issues they haven't verbalized, identify underlying patterns that contribute to relationship problems, and help clients develop new ways of thinking about their experiences. These abilities require sophisticated pattern recognition and problem-solving skills that operate in the social and emotional domain, rather than the abstract reasoning domain that IQ tests measure. Advanced brain imaging studies conducted in 2025 using sophisticated fMRI technology have provided compelling evidence that different types of intelligence activate distinct neural networks within the brain. Researchers found that individuals with strong musical abilities show heightened activity in auditory processing regions, while people with exceptional spatial reasoning demonstrate increased activation in visual processing areas. These distinct patterns of neural activity suggest that intelligence really operates as multiple semi-independent systems rather than a single unified capacity. Brain imaging research reveals that people who excel in different cognitive domains literally use their brains differently. Musicians show enhanced connectivity between auditory and motor regions that reflects their ability to translate heard patterns into physical performance. Athletes demonstrate specialized activation in areas that coordinate visual processing with motor control. Artists show unique patterns of activity in regions associated with visual creativity and spatial reasoning. These neurological differences explain why someone can struggle with standardized tests while excelling in their career, relationships, or creative pursuits. Their brain may be optimized for forms of intelligence that don't align with what IQ tests measure, but that prove crucial for success in other domains. The mismatch between test performance and real-world achievement reflects the limitations of assessment tools rather than deficiencies in cognitive ability. Multiple intelligence theory explains the common experience of knowing people who performed poorly in school but became highly successful in careers that matched their cognitive strengths. These individuals weren't less intelligent than their high-achieving classmates. They possessed forms of intelligence that traditional educational systems and testing methods failed to recognize or develop. Understanding intelligence as multifaceted rather than singular changes how we should think about human cognitive diversity. Instead of ranking people from smart to dumb based on narrow test performance, we can recognize that everyone possesses different combinations of cognitive strengths that contribute to their unique capabilities and potential contributions to society. But among all these different forms of intelligence, one type stands out as particularly crucial for real-world success, yet remains completely absent from traditional IQ assessments. Emotional intelligence. The smart money is on EQ, not IQ. Emotional intelligence represents that crucial cognitive domain, encompassing your ability to recognize and understand your own emotional states, accurately read other people's feelings, and manage interpersonal relationships with skill and sensitivity. These capabilities operate through sophisticated cognitive processes that traditional intelligence tests completely overlook, yet they determine outcomes in ways that abstract reasoning ability simply cannot match. A comprehensive longitudinal study published in 2024 tracked thousands of individuals over multiple decades and produced results that should fundamentally change how we think about human intelligence. The researchers found that people with high emotional intelligence consistently earned more money, maintained more satisfying relationships, and reported significantly higher levels of life satisfaction compared to individuals with high IQ scores but average emotional intelligence. The financial advantage alone was substantial, with high EQ individuals earning an average of 25% more than their high IQ counterparts throughout their careers. The workplace provides perhaps the clearest demonstration of emotional intelligence's practical advantages over traditional cognitive testing. Leadership positions require the ability to motivate diverse teams, navigate complex organizational politics, and make decisions under pressure while managing the emotional reactions of multiple stakeholders. These skills demand sophisticated information processing and pattern recognition abilities, but they operate in the social and emotional domain rather than the abstract reasoning space that IQ tests measure. Research published in the Journal of Applied Psychology found that employees with high emotional intelligence were 30% more likely to receive promotions to leadership positions, regardless of their performance on traditional intelligence assessments. This promotion advantage occurred across multiple industries and organizational structures, suggesting that emotional intelligence provides universal benefits for career advancement that IQ scores cannot match. Many of the most successful CEOs in major corporations demonstrate this pattern clearly. They often possess average or above-average IQ scores, but exhibit exceptional emotional intelligence that enables them to understand market psychology, build strong organizational cultures, and maintain stakeholder relationships during challenging periods. These leaders excel at reading rooms full of investors, motivating employees during difficult transitions, and making strategic decisions that account for human factors as well as financial considerations. The cognitive skills required for effective leadership involve processing social information, recognizing emotional patterns, and predicting how different people will respond to various approaches. A CEO facing a potential merger must understand how employees will react to uncertainty, how customers will respond to changes in company culture, and how investors will interpret different communication strategies. This complex social reasoning requires the same kind of pattern recognition and predictive thinking that IQ tests measure, but it operates through emotional and interpersonal channels rather than mathematical or verbal ones. Emotional intelligence also encompasses self-awareness and self-regulation capabilities that prove crucial for making sound decisions and recovering from setbacks. People with high emotional intelligence recognize their own emotional triggers, understand how their feelings affect their judgment, and develop strategies for managing their reactions during stressful situations. These self-management skills translate directly into better decision-making and more resilient responses to challenges. Personal relationships provide another arena where emotional intelligence demonstrates clear advantages over raw intellectual ability. Building trust requires understanding how your actions affect other people's feelings and adjusting your behavior to create emotional safety. Effective communication involves recognizing when someone feels misunderstood and finding ways to express your perspective without triggering defensive reactions. Long-term relationship compatibility depends more on emotional understanding and mutual support than on intellectual discussions or shared academic interests. A 2024 study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships examined romantic relationship satisfaction and found that individuals with high emotional intelligence reported 45% more satisfying partnerships compared to those with high IQ scores but average emotional intelligence. The researchers discovered that emotional intelligence predicted relationship longevity, conflict resolution success, and overall partnership satisfaction more accurately than traditional cognitive assessments. Academic environments also reveal the practical advantages of emotional intelligence over traditional test-taking ability. Students with high emotional intelligence often outperform peers with higher IQ scores because they possess superior stress management skills, stronger help-seeking behaviors, and better collaborative abilities. These students recognize when they're struggling with material and seek appropriate assistance rather than allowing frustration to interfere with their learning. Research from the Harvard Business Review demonstrates that teams with high collective emotional intelligence show 20% greater productivity and 15% higher employee retention rates compared to teams selected primarily based on traditional intelligence metrics. These productivity gains result from better communication, more effective conflict resolution, and stronger collaborative problem-solving abilities that emerge when team members understand and manage their emotional interactions skillfully. The workplace benefits of emotional intelligence extend beyond individual performance to encompass organizational culture and team dynamics. Employees with high emotional intelligence create more positive work environments, contribute to better morale, and help organizations adapt more effectively to change. They recognize when colleagues are struggling and provide appropriate support, identify potential conflicts before they escalate, and maintain productive relationships even during stressful periods. Despite this overwhelming evidence supporting the practical importance of emotional intelligence, educational systems and testing industries continue to prioritize traditional IQ assessments that ignore these crucial cognitive abilities. This misplaced emphasis has led society to undervalue some of the most important skills humans possess for navigating complex social environments and achieving meaningful success. The focus on abstract reasoning and mathematical computation has created generations of people who excel at standardized testing, but struggle with the interpersonal challenges that determine career advancement, relationship satisfaction, and overall life fulfillment. We have trained people to solve puzzles quickly while neglecting to develop their capacity for understanding emotions, managing relationships, and creating collaborative solutions to real-world problems. Understanding the superior predictive power of emotional intelligence should fundamentally change how we evaluate human potential and make decisions about education, hiring, and personal development. The cognitive abilities required for emotional intelligence represent sophisticated information processing that deserves recognition as a legitimate and valuable form of human intelligence. But the evidence supporting this shift in perspective extends far beyond individual studies and anecdotal observations. The 2025 data that's changing everything. Research published throughout 2025 has produced findings that should force everyone to reconsider what intelligence tests actually measure and whether they provide meaningful information about human cognitive ability. The evidence emerging from multiple scientific disciplines paints a picture that contradicts decades of assumptions about IQ testing and reveals fundamental problems with how we understand and assess intelligence. A massive meta-analysis published in early 2025 examined over 500 separate studies spanning decades of intelligence research and produced results that challenge the entire foundation of IQ-based thinking. The researchers found that while IQ tests demonstrate reasonable predictive power for academic performance within traditional educational settings, they perform terribly when it comes to forecasting real-world success across various life domains. This finding suggests that the cognitive skills measured by standardized tests represent only a narrow slice of the abilities that actually matter for achievement outside of school environments. The academic prediction capability that IQ tests do possess appears to reflect their alignment with the specific types of thinking that traditional educational systems value rather than their ability to measure comprehensive intelligence. Students who excel at rapid pattern recognition, abstract reasoning under time pressure, and recall of culturally specific information naturally perform well in educational environments designed around similar principles. But these same abilities often fail to translate into success in careers, relationships, or creative endeavors that require different cognitive approaches. Advanced brain imaging studies conducted in 2025 using sophisticated fMRI technology have revolutionized our understanding of how intelligent behavior actually operates within the human brain. These studies reveal that cognitive performance involves complex, interconnected networks distributed throughout multiple brain regions, rather than localized activity in the specific areas that IQ tests target. The imaging data shows that intelligent behavior emerges from dynamic interactions between different neural systems working together in coordinated ways. Traditional IQ tests focus primarily on functions associated with specific brain regions involved in logical reasoning, working memory, and verbal processing. But the 2025 brain imaging research demonstrates that real-world intelligence requires integration across visual processing areas, emotional regulation centers, social cognition networks, and creative thinking regions that operate simultaneously during complex problem-solving tasks. This distributed neural activity suggests that reducing intelligence to performance on narrow cognitive tasks misses the majority of what makes human thinking sophisticated and adaptable. Artificial intelligence research has produced perhaps the most damaging evidence against traditional IQ testing by demonstrating that computers can now easily replicate the pattern recognition skills that these tests measure. AI systems consistently outperform humans on tasks involving logical reasoning, mathematical computation, and abstract pattern identification that form the core of standardized intelligence assessments. This technological advancement reveals that the cognitive abilities measured by IQ tests represent a relatively narrow form of information processing that can be mechanically reproduced. Meanwhile, the cognitive abilities that distinguish human intelligence from artificial systems remain largely invisible to traditional testing methods. Creativity, empathy, cultural understanding, and adaptive problem-solving require forms of thinking that current AI cannot replicate effectively. These uniquely human capabilities involve integrating emotional information with logical analysis, understanding social context and cultural nuances, and generating novel solutions that go beyond pattern matching and rule application. The fact that machines can now exceed human performance on IQ test tasks while struggling with abilities that humans develop naturally suggests that we have been measuring the wrong aspects of intelligence. The cognitive skills that make humans uniquely intelligent operate through mechanisms that traditional tests completely ignore, focusing instead on computational abilities that represent our weakest area compared to artificial systems. Genetic research conducted in 2025 has revealed that intelligence results from interactions among thousands of genes working together in complex ways that make it far more complicated than early researchers imagined. This genetic complexity undermines the entire premise of treating intelligence as a simple, measurable trait that can be captured through standardized testing. The research shows that cognitive abilities emerge from intricate biological processes involving multiple genetic pathways that interact with environmental factors in ways that resist easy quantification. Educational intervention research has shown that approaches focusing on growth mindset and multiple learning styles produce cognitive improvements that traditional IQ-based methods miss entirely. Students who learn to view intelligence as malleable rather than fixed demonstrate enhanced performance across various cognitive domains. Teaching methods that accommodate different learning preferences and cognitive strengths enable students to develop abilities that don't show up on standardized assessments, but prove crucial for real-world success. These educational findings suggest that intelligence is much more malleable than IQ testing implies. Research in 2025 shows that intensive training programs designed to develop specific cognitive skills have demonstrated the ability to improve performance across multiple domains simultaneously. This plasticity indicates that cognitive abilities can be enhanced through targeted interventions and practice in ways that traditional testing approaches ignore or undervalue. Perhaps most importantly, the 2025 research suggests that we have been asking the wrong fundamental question about human intelligence. Instead of trying to determine how smart are you through numerical rankings, we should be exploring how are you smart by recognizing the diverse ways that different individuals demonstrate cognitive ability. This shift in perspective acknowledges that intelligence operates through multiple channels and manifests in various forms that cannot be captured through single-score assessments. The evidence from multiple research domains converges on the conclusion that traditional IQ testing provides limited and potentially misleading information about human cognitive ability. The tests measure a narrow range of skills that correlate with performance in specific academic settings, but fail to capture the broader spectrum of abilities that determine success and fulfillment in life. This new research is forcing psychologists to completely rethink how we understand and measure human intelligence. The scientific community is beginning to acknowledge that decades of IQ-based research may have been built on fundamentally flawed assumptions about what intelligence is and how it can be assessed. The 2025 data reveals that intelligence represents a far more complex and multifaceted phenomenon than traditional testing methods can capture. Yet something powerful keeps drawing us back to these numerical rankings despite all the evidence against them. Why we're addicted to quantifying smartness. This psychological pull toward numerical intelligence rankings runs deeper than simple curiosity about cognitive ability. Humans possess a fundamental drive to rank and categorize everything around us, from sports teams to movie ratings to professional salaries. Intelligence feels far too important and consequential to leave unmeasured, so we convince ourselves that standardized tests can capture something meaningful about cognitive ability. This need for measurement reflects our discomfort with ambiguity and our preference for concrete data over nuanced understanding. The appeal of IQ tests lies in their promise to reduce the enormous complexity of human thinking to a single, easily comparable number. Instead of grappling with the reality that people demonstrate intelligence in countless different ways depending on context, culture, and individual strengths, we can simply say someone has an IQ of 120 and feel like we understand their cognitive capabilities. This reduction satisfies our desire for simplicity while completely missing the actual complexity of human intelligence. The competitive aspect of IQ testing feeds directly into our need to establish social hierarchies and feel superior to others. Someone who discovers they have an above-average IQ score experiences a boost in self-esteem that seems backed by scientific objectivity. Conversely, people who score lower may feel validated in their insecurities about their intellectual abilities. These emotional reactions occur despite the fact that the scores measure only a narrow range of cognitive skills that have limited relevance to real-world success or meaningful contribution to society. Educational systems embrace IQ testing because these assessments provide seemingly scientific justification for sorting students into different tracks and programs. School administrators can point at test scores when explaining why certain children receive gifted services while others get placed in remedial classes. This numerical sorting system appears objective and fair, even though it primarily reflects cultural advantages and test-taking skills rather than actual learning potential or intellectual capability. The appeal of IQ-based sorting extends beyond individual student placement to broader policy decisions about resource allocation and educational strategies. Policymakers can use aggregate test score data to make decisions about funding, curriculum design, and program implementation, while feeling confident that their choices rest on solid scientific foundation. This confidence persists even when the underlying measurements capture only a fraction of what students actually need to succeed academically and personally. Employers have adopted IQ-like testing because evaluating cognitive ability through standardized assessments feels easier and more objective than actually assessing someone's capacity to perform specific job responsibilities. Human resources departments can administer tests that produce numerical scores, then compare candidates based on these numbers rather than conducting the more complex and time-consuming process of evaluating how well someone might actually function in the role. This approach to hiring appeals to managers who want to feel like their decisions are based on data rather than subjective impressions. The tests create an appearance of scientific rigor in the selection process, even though the cognitive skills measured often have little connection to job performance requirements. Companies continue using these assessments because they provide legal protection against discrimination claims and simplify the decision-making process, regardless of their actual effectiveness at identifying good employees. The self-help industry has built a massive business around our obsession with quantifying intelligence. Companies sell brain training programs that promise to boost IQ scores, market cognitive enhancement supplements that claim to improve mental performance, and offer courses that teach test-taking strategies disguised as intelligence improvement methods. These products appeal to people who believe that higher scores translate into better life outcomes, and who want to feel like they're actively improving their intellectual capabilities. The marketing for these products exploits our fundamental misunderstanding of what intelligence tests actually measure. Advertisements suggest that raising your IQ score will lead to career advancement, academic success, and personal fulfillment. They tap into insecurities about intellectual ability while offering simple solutions that promise measurable improvement. The fact that these programs typically focus on narrow test-taking skills rather than broader cognitive development gets lost in marketing messages that emphasize numerical score improvements. Social media has amplified our intelligence quantification obsession by creating platforms where people share their online IQ test results like personality type indicators or horoscope signs. Social networks feature groups dedicated to discussing and comparing test scores, with members treating their numbers as fundamental aspects of their identity. This phenomenon represents a peculiar form of digital-age intellectual posturing, where people seek validation through standardized measurements rather than actual accomplishments or contributions. The ease of taking online IQ tests has made this score-sharing behavior even more prevalent. Websites offering quick intelligence assessments for small fees have created a culture where people can instantly obtain numerical ratings of their cognitive ability. These platforms generate impressive-looking score reports that people then share across social media, creating the impression that they've discovered something meaningful about their intellectual capacity through a 15-minute online quiz. The addiction to quantifying intelligence may actually be reducing our collective intellectual capacity by causing us to ignore forms of thinking that resist easy measurement. When we focus exclusively on the narrow cognitive skills that standardized tests evaluate, we neglect to develop creativity, emotional intelligence, social awareness, and practical problem-solving abilities that prove crucial for real-world success. This narrow focus creates a generation of people who excel at test-taking, but struggle with the complex, ambiguous challenges that characterize actual intelligent behavior. Educational systems that prioritize test score improvement over comprehensive cognitive development produce students who can perform well on standardized assessments, but lack the adaptability, creativity, and interpersonal skills needed for meaningful contribution to society. The emphasis on quantifiable intelligence metrics leads to teaching methods that emphasize drilling specific test-taking strategies rather than fostering genuine intellectual curiosity and critical thinking abilities. The ultimate irony in our obsession with quantifying intelligence is that truly intelligent behavior often involves recognizing the limitations of simple measurements and embracing complexity rather than reducing it to numbers. The smartest response to human cognitive diversity might be acknowledging that intelligence operates in ways too sophisticated and multifaceted to capture through standardized testing. Despite all this evidence showing the fundamental flaws in how we measure and understand intelligence, we continue to treat these century-old assessments as if they reveal meaningful truths about human cognitive ability. The time has come to abandon these outdated measurement systems and embrace a more sophisticated understanding of human cognitive ability. The research from 2025 makes one thing absolutely clear. IQ tests measure a narrow slice of cognitive ability that correlates with academic performance, but reveals very little about human intelligence in all its complexity. When someone brags about their high IQ score, they're essentially celebrating how well they performed on a century-old diagnostic tool that Alfred Binet created specifically for French school children who needed extra help with their studies. True intelligence might actually be recognizing that no single number can capture the beautiful complexity of how human minds work, learn, and create in the real world.